Somewhere in the human imagination, a ship sits stranded on a mountain. The floodwaters have pulled back. The world below is quiet, reshaped, almost unrecognizable. And this vessel, enormous, ancient, impossibly far from any sea, rests at the edge of a story that billions of people have carried forward across thousands of years. That image is one of the most persistent in all of human culture. The Ark of Noah, a ship large enough to hold a world's worth of life. A craft built not for exploration or trade or war, but for survival at the end of everything. It appears in scripture, in older clay tablets, in flood myths spread across nearly every civilization that ever kept records, and in the imaginations of explorers who have spent their lives and fortunes searching the slopes of a Turkish mountain for physical proof that the vessel actually existed. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. What makes the Ark such a compelling subject is that it refuses to stay in one category. It is theological cornerstone for three major world religions. It is a literary artifact with roots deep in Mesopotamian antiquity. It is an engineering puzzle that naval architects still argue about. And it is the object of one of the longest, strangest treasure hunts in modern history. Whether you approach it as scripture, as mythology, as geology, or as a shipbuilding problem, the Ark keeps generating new questions. This video follows 5 distinct paths into that puzzle. The first is the biblical text itself. What it actually says, what those famous dimensions mean when you translate cubits into meters, and what kind of vessel Genesis is describing when it specifies a craft roughly 134 meters long, 22 meters wide, and 13 meters tall. The second path leads further back in time, to clay tablets older than the Bible, where a figure named Atrahasis survives a divine flood in a boat that bears a striking resemblance to Noah's. Those tablets, preserved from the reign of a Babylonian king around 1647 BCE, are not a coincidence. They are a window into how the flood story evolved across millennia, passing through cultures and languages, picking up details and losing others, until it became the narrative we recognize today. The third path is the engineering question, and it is more serious than it might sound. If you were going to build a wooden vessel to the specifications in Genesis, could it actually float under the weight of thousands of animals, months of provisions, and its own structural mass? How would the hull handle open water stress? How would you ventilate it, manage waste, keep predators separated from prey? These are not theological questions. They are seamanship questions, and the answers are genuinely fascinating. The fourth path is geological. 2 locations anchor that investigation. One is the Black Sea, where a hypothesis first proposed in 1997 suggests that the Bosporus Strait breached around 5600 BCE, sending roughly 50 cubic kilometers of Mediterranean water per day pouring into what had been a much smaller freshwater lake, flooding an area of approximately 100,000 square kilometers. If something close to that happened, it would have looked, to anyone living along those shores, like the end of the world. The second location is the Durupınar Formation on the slopes of Mount Ararat, a 150-meter boat-shaped mound of limestone that has drawn researchers, believers, and skeptics in roughly equal measure. Between 2021 and 2023, soil and rock samples from the site returned evidence of marine clay, mollusk shells, and organic material dated between 3,500 and 5,000 years old. The dating places human activity at the site squarely within the Chalcolithic period, the age most often linked to the biblical flood narrative. Most geologists still read durupınar as a natural geological formation, but the debate is far from closed, and the site remains one of the most genuinely contested locations in the archaeology of ancient religion. The fifth path is the human story of the search itself. the expeditions to Ararat, the claimed sightings, the satellite imagery analyses, and the modern reconstructions that have tried to answer the engineering questions by actually building the thing. A Dutch carpenter built a full-scale replica that launched in 2012. A theme park in Kentucky opened a 510-foot recreation in 2016. Engineers and historians have used three-dimensional modelling to test the structural tolerances of ancient timber at biblical scale. The Ark, it turns out, is not just a theological artifact. It is a recurring experiment in what human beings believe is possible. Running beneath all 5 of these paths is a central tension that the video will keep returning to. There is the weight of belief, sincere, ancient, and held by an enormous portion of humanity. There is the discipline of evidence, geology, archaeology, naval engineering, comparative literature, which asks different questions and does not always arrive at the same answers. And there is something harder to name, the deep human pull toward finding a real ship behind a powerful story. The desire to locate, touch, and measure the thing that the narrative describes. That tension is not a flaw in the investigation. It is what makes the investigation worth having. The Ark exists at the edge of memory, old enough that no living tradition can trace its true origin, strange enough that it has never stopped generating serious scholarship, and large enough in the human imagination that it has shaped how entire civilizations understand catastrophe, survival, and the relationship between the world as it is and the world as it was. We're going to follow it from the first surviving tablets to the latest sediment cores, from ancient Mesopotamia to a mountain in eastern Turkey, from scripture to a naval architect's stress analysis. The ship is waiting. Let's find out what we actually know. The story begins with a world gone wrong. In the 6th chapter of Genesis, God looks down at what creation has become and finds it saturated with violence. Humanity, multiplied across the earth, has turned almost entirely corrupt. The text does not linger on the details of that corruption. It simply states that the thoughts of the human heart were evil, continuously, and that God regretted making people at all. Out of that grief comes a decision to unmake what had been made, to wash the world clean with water, and to start again with a single family. Noah is the exception. The text calls him righteous, blameless among the people of his generation, a man who walked with God, and so the divine command comes to him specifically. Build a vessel, gather your family, bring aboard living creatures, 2 of every unclean animal and 7 pairs of every clean species, and wait. The vessel he is commanded to build is described with unusual precision. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits tall, 3 decks, a single door in its side, an opening running near the roof for air. The material is called gopher wood, a term that appears nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible, and whose exact meaning scholars still dispute. Constructed in compartments, coated inside and out with pitch. When you translate those cubits into modern measurements, the numbers become striking. The Hebrew cubit runs somewhere between 44 and 53 centimeters, depending on the source, with most scholars using roughly 48 centimeters as a working figure. That puts the Ark at approximately 144 meters long, 24 meters wide and 14 meters tall, not far from the length of a modern cargo ship. For a wooden vessel built in the ancient world, the dimensions are extraordinary, and they matter enormously for later debates about whether such a ship could have functioned. The numbers also carry structural significance. The proportions themselves are notably stable for a floating barge, better suited to surviving waves than to steering through them. The Ark, as described, is not meant to go anywhere. It is meant to survive. Then the flood comes. Rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights. The fountains of the deep burst open. The waters rise until they cover even the highest mountains, and everything that breathes outside the ark dies. For 150 days the waters dominate the earth. Then, slowly, they begin to recede. On the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The text does not name a single peak. It says mountains, a range, a region, a place. That ambiguity will matter enormously to the people who later spend their lives searching for the whole's resting place. Noah tests the world through birds. He first releases a raven, which flies back and forth without landing, finding nothing dry. Then he sends a dove, which returns because it has nowhere to settle. 7 days later he sends the dove again, and this time it comes back with a freshly plucked olive leaf in its beak. One of the most enduring images in the entire narrative, a small green sign that the earth is habitable again. A third flight, and the dove does not return. The land is ready. The family comes out. The animals come out. Noah builds an altar and makes an offering, and God responds with a covenant. The first formal promise in the Bible between the divine and all of creation, not just humanity. Never again will all life be destroyed by flood. The sign of that covenant is the rainbow. What makes this account so layered is what it chooses not to say. It specifies the ark's dimensions, but says nothing about how it was steered, who else helped build it, how long construction took, or how the animal population was managed across months at sea. It gives flood duration figures, 40 days of rain, 150 days of inundation, that reflect, scholars now recognize, two distinct source traditions woven together by later editors. The text does not try to hide these seams, it simply moves forward. The story functions on 3 registers at once. It is moral drama, a meditation on corruption and judgment, and the cost of a world that loses its way. It is a survival narrative, one of the oldest and most visceral in any literature, a family, a boat, the last animals, against everything. And it is a maritime image of rare power, a sealed wooden vessel riding the death of one world and delivering the seed of another to a mountain in the east. Every question this story has generated since, about engineering, about geology, about origins, begins here in these precise and deliberately incomplete chapters of Genesis. But Genesis was not the first place this story was told. Long before the Hebrew scribes shaped those chapters into their final form, a different civilization was already writing about floods, about divine anger, about a chosen man warned in secret, about a great boat loaded with living creatures. These stories did not come from the same tradition and then diverge. The evidence runs the other direction. The flood narrative, in its essential architecture, was already ancient when the biblical version was composed. To understand Noah, you have to go back further, to the river valleys of Mesopotamia, to the cities of Babylon and Nippur and Nineveh, and to the clay tablets buried beneath their ruins for 2,000 years. The older story belongs to a man named Atrahasis. The Atrahasis epic is an Akkadian composition, and the most complete surviving version was written during the reign of the Babylonian king Ammi-Saduqa, somewhere around 1646 to 1626 BCE. That makes it older than the oldest complete manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible by more than 1,000 years. But even those tablets were not originals. They were copies of something older still, reaching back into oral and written tradition well before Babylon's ascendancy. In the Atrahasis narrative, the world is crowded and loud. The gods, disturbed by the noise of humanity, try repeatedly to reduce the population, first through plague, then through drought and famine. Each time, the humans survive with divine help. Finally, the gods agree on a more definitive solution, a flood to end everything. But one god, Enki, refuses to let the plan unfold without warning. He goes to Atrahasis, a priest and a righteous man, and speaks to him through a reed wall. a thin partition through which a god can pass a secret without technically breaking the divine council's decree. The instruction is precise: build a watertight boat, stock it with food, with live birds and fish, keep the date of the flood secret, and wait. The parallels with Genesis are not vague, they are structural and specific. A man chosen for his righteousness, a God who warns him before the destruction, a vessel built to survive the flood, animals taken aboard, a catastrophe that ends an age, and a new beginning on the other side of the water. Then comes the Epic of Gilgamesh, and here the thread becomes even more visible. The Epic of Gilgamesh is among the oldest long-form narratives in human literature. It follows Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, through friendship, loss, and an obsessive search for immortality. In that search he eventually reaches Utnapishtim, the one mortal who has been granted eternal life, and he asks him how. Utnapishtim answers by telling his story, which is essentially the flood story, transplanted directly into the larger epic. The tablet that contains this episode, known as Tablet 11, is called the Flood Tablet, and it preserves one of the most complete flood accounts in the ancient world. Utnapishtim, like Atrahasis, is warned by Ea, the same deity known in the Atrahasis story as Enki. The instructions are the same in their essentials. Build a great vessel, bring your family, bring the seed of all living things. The boat Utnapishtim constructs is described with specific dimensions. A massive structure with 6 decks and multiple compartments. And when the flood recedes, Utnapishtim tests the world in a way that will feel immediately familiar to any reader of Genesis. He releases a dove, which finds no resting place and returns. He releases a swallow, which also returns. Finally he releases a raven, which flies off and does not come back. The land has reappeared, the flood is over. The vessel comes to rest on a mountain, Mount Nisya in the text. The bird sequence, the mountain landing, the divine warning, the sealed boat, the survival of life through catastrophe. Every pillar of the Genesis story is already standing in Mesopotamia centuries earlier. Comparative scholars have established that the Gilgamesh flood episode was borrowed directly from the Atrahasis tradition. The dimensions, the compartments, the post-flood bird release are not coincidental resemblances. They are deliberate inclusions by scribes who knew the older material and incorporated it into the Gilgamesh framework. The exact timing of that insertion remains debated, with many scholars pointing to the work of a scribe-editor named Sinleki Unini, who is thought to have compiled a standard version of the Gilgamesh epic somewhere between 1300 and 1000 BCE. But the core material is older than that editor, and older than his sources as well. What does this mean for the biblical account? It means the flood narrative travelled, through oral transmission, through scribal copying, through cultural contact across the ancient Near East, and that the Hebrew version is part of a long literary conversation rather than an isolated revelation. It does not mean the stories are identical. The differences are real and significant. The motivations of the divine differ. The moral register differs. In Genesis, the flood is a response to human wickedness. In Atrahasis, it is closer to a population management problem among the gods. The covenant that follows in Genesis, sealed with a rainbow, is absent from the Mesopotamian versions. These are not the same story wearing different names. They are variations on a shared architecture, shaped by distinct theological and cultural purposes. But none of this would be known without an extraordinary chapter in the history of archaeology and scholarship, a chapter that is itself a kind of rediscovery narrative. For nearly 2,000 years, the Mesopotamian flood traditions were simply gone. The cities of ancient Babylon and Nineveh lay buried under centuries of soil and silence. Their libraries, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform script, were unknown to the wider world. Then, Beginning in the mid-19th century, excavators began moving earth in what is now Iraq, pulling fragments of baked clay from the ruins of ancient palaces and temples. In the 1840s and 1850s, figures like Austin Henry Layard and later Hormuzd Rassam uncovered the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, a royal collection of cuneiform texts that had survived underground for millennia. Among those tablets was the Flood Tablet, Tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh epic, recovered by Rassam and transported to the British Museum. But a tablet in a museum is only a fragment of pottery without someone who can read it. That is where George Smith enters the story. Smith was not a classicist by training. He was a banknote engraver who had developed an obsessive passion for the cuneiform tablets at the British Museum and eventually talked his way into a position as an assistant curator. He taught himself the script, working carefully through the fragmentary and difficult texts, and in 1872 he deciphered the Flood Tablet and recognized what it was: a flood story, told in Akkadian, describing events that preceded the biblical account and mirrored it in detail. When he announced his discovery publicly in December of that year, the reaction was immediate and electric. The newspaper funded his return expedition to Nineveh to find the missing portions of the tablet. The cuneiform recovery had begun decades earlier, when Henry Rawlinson painstakingly copied and decoded old Persian inscriptions at Behistun in the 1840s and 1850s, cracking the script that made all later translations possible. It was slow, precise work, the kind of scholarship that looks from the outside like staring at rocks, and looking from the inside like reconstructing an entire lost civilization one wedge mark at a time. The Atrahasis tablets themselves, the oldest versions, had their own path into modern scholarship. The most complete copy was acquired by J.P. Morgan and Company and first published in 1898, decades after Smith's Gilgamesh announcement. Scholars recognized immediately that they were reading something that had fed into the Gilgamesh tradition, an even older layer of the same story. What the tablets collectively revealed was not simply a parallel to Genesis. They revealed a narrative tradition of extraordinary durability, a story about divine judgment, a chosen survivor, a floating refuge, and the remaking of the world, passed from culture to culture and scribe to scribe across at least 2,000 years of recorded history, and almost certainly longer before that. The clay held the memory when every other medium had dissolved, and it took a banknote engraver staring at a broken tablet in a London museum to bring that memory back into the world. The Mesopotamian traditions were not alone. That is the thing that strikes you when you start pulling at the thread. The story does not stop at the borders of the ancient Near East. It moves east, west, south, and across oceans into cultures that had no documented contact with Babylon, no access to cuneiform tablets, no reason to share a narrative unless something deeper was at work. A 2023 comparative study published in the International Journal of History documented flood narratives across Hindu, Buddhist, Zoroastrian, Jewish, Christian, Islamic, Greek, Chinese, and indigenous Australian traditions. What the researchers found was not just a vague resemblance between stories that all involve water, it was structural. The same architecture kept appearing, a divine warning issued to a specific individual, a chosen survivor set apart from a doomed population, a vessel or elevated refuge that preserves life, pairs of animals or symbolic living creatures, a landing on high ground once the waters recede, and a theme of renewal, a world remade from near total destruction. These are not random convergences. They are a fingerprint that appears on stories separated by thousands of miles and centuries of independent development. In Hindu tradition, the story appears in both the Shatapatha Brahmana and the Mahabharata. A fish, later identified as an avatar of Vishnu, warns the sage Manu that a great flood is coming. Manu builds a ship. he ties it to the fish, which guides the vessel through the rising waters to a northern mountain. The animals, the warning, the mountain, the chosen survivor, all present, all structurally aligned with the patterns found in the Near East. The Buddhist tradition carries its own flood narratives, particularly in South and Southeast Asian contexts, where inundation becomes a vehicle for cosmological renewal and the transfer of wisdom between ages. In Zoroastrian texts, the figure of Yima is warned by the god Ahura Mazda to build a vara, an enclosure, to protect the finest of humanity and animals against a killing winter and flood, a variation that swaps the medium of destruction but preserves the structure of divine warning, chosen protector, and preserved life. Greek tradition gives us Deucalion, son of Prometheus, warned by his father that Zeus intends to destroy humanity. Deucalion builds a chest, some translations say a chest, others a boat, and survives a deluge with his wife Pyrrha. When the waters fall, their vessel comes to rest on Mount Parnassus, or, in other versions, Mount Othrys. They repopulate the world. The parallels are close enough that ancient writers themselves commented on them, drawing explicit comparisons between Deucalion and Noah, and noting that the Greek and Near Eastern traditions seem to be describing the same event. Move further east, and the picture becomes more complex, which is important. Chinese flood mythology does not fit neatly into the divine warning vessel mountain framework. Its dominant themes cluster differently. Heroes who control or tame the flood rather than escape it, a cosmological rearrangement of the landscape, and in many southern Chinese traditions, a brother-sister or aunt-nephew couple who survive the destruction and repopulate the earth. That repopulation motif echoes the chosen survivor with a partner pattern found in other traditions, but the mechanism is different. There is no ark, there is no mountain landing. Instead, there are figures who manage the water, redirect it, build channels. The flood is not primarily an escape story. It is a confrontation story. These distinctions matter because they resist easy classification. Chinese flood mythology shares some structural DNA with the global pattern, but it also contains details that do not translate, that carry their own internal logic rooted in the geography and the agricultural realities of river valley civilization in East Asia. Indigenous Australian traditions add another layer. Among the Yorta Yorta people, the Dungala Walla flood story describes a catastrophic breach in a river system and a communal response, communities working together to dig channels and release the flood waters, redirecting destruction through collective effort. This is not a story about a single chosen survivor elevated above the rest. It is a story about a community's response to an overwhelming natural event, and it has persisted in oral tradition across enormous stretches of time. Flood memory in Indigenous Australian context reflects something that runs through many of these global narratives. The communities that live closest to water, in river valleys, coastal settlements, and monsoon-driven agricultural landscapes, are the ones for whom flood stories carry the deepest operational significance. The myth is not merely a cosmological curiosity for such communities. It encodes warnings, responses, and knowledge about landscapes that can kill you if you forget what water can do. This is part of why flood myths are so durable. They survive because they are useful. A culture that lives in a flood plain, that has watched rivers overtop their banks in living memory, that has grandparents who remember the year the delta swallowed 3 villages. That culture has every reason to encode the knowledge of catastrophic inundation into its most memorable narrative forms. Stories that carry survival information tend not to be forgotten. The flood myth is, among other things, a mnemonic device for the reality of living near water in a world without weather satellites or flood management infrastructure. So why do the stories from such different cultures share the same motifs? There are three serious explanations, and scholars continue to disagree about how much weight to give each one. The first is diffusion, the direct transmission of stories along trade routes, through conquest and migration, through the kind of cultural contact that the ancient world supported more extensively than is often appreciated. Mesopotamian flood narratives could have travelled west into the Levant and eventually into Greek and Hebrew tradition. They could have moved along Indian Ocean trade networks into South Asian religious literature. The ancient world was not sealed. Stories moved. The second explanation is independent invention. The idea that when cultures living in flood-prone environments face catastrophic inundation, they independently develop narratives with similar structures, because similar experiences generate similar stories. Floods are universally terrifying and transformative. The story of a person who survives while others perish, who preserves something valuable and emerges to rebuild, may simply be the natural shape that catastrophic survival narratives take, regardless of cultural origin. The third explanation is shared memory, the possibility that some of these traditions preserve a genuine cultural recollection of real flooding events, perhaps large enough to have been experienced by populations across a broad region, and that the stories carry that memory forward in narrative form even after the specific event has been lost to documented history. The 2023 comparative study was careful on this point, and that carefulness is worth respecting. The researchers explicitly noted that the widespread parallel motifs do not prove a single historic flood. They cannot. Identifying structural similarities between myths is a different kind of evidence than identifying geological signatures of a specific event. The parallels are real and they are striking. They are not conclusive proof of a single catastrophic flood that swept through every corner of the inhabited world simultaneously. Treating them as such is a step that the evidence does not support, and it is a step that tends to collapse genuinely different traditions into a false uniformity, imposing a single story on cultural memories that, examined closely, are doing different things, serving different communities, encoding different kinds of knowledge. What the parallels do suggest is that catastrophic flooding is a near-universal human experience, that the narrative instinct to make meaning from that experience is equally universal, and that some combination of diffusion, independent invention, and genuine remembered catastrophe has distributed flood stories across the globe with a consistency that commands serious attention. The story of the vessel, the survivor, the preserved life, and the mountain landing is not a coincidence. But precisely what it is remains an open question, and that open question is only deepened when you look more closely at the specific vessel described in the biblical account, because whoever wrote down those specifications was not speaking in generalities. They were talking about a particular kind of ship with exact measurements, built from a specific material, designed for a purpose that no shipwright before or since has ever been asked to fulfill. The specifications in Genesis 6:15 are precise enough to make a shipwright stop and pay attention. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits tall. Those are not the vague dimensions of a legendary vessel. They are the kind of numbers you write down when you're actually trying to build something, and yet when you start working with them, you find layers of meaning that go beyond engineering. At the most commonly accepted cubit length of roughly 45 centimeters, the arc works out to approximately 137 meters long, 23 meters wide, and 14 meters tall. That puts it in the range of a large 19th century sailing vessel, not the mountainous cruise ship that popular imagination sometimes conjures, but a genuinely formidable structure. Its internal volume comes to somewhere around 42,000 cubic meters, the equivalent of roughly 40,000 tons of displacement. In terms of raw capacity, that is a serious ship. The proportions, a length-to-width ratio of 6:1, are also strikingly practical. Modern naval architects recognize that ratio as one that provides good longitudinal stability without being so narrow that the vessel becomes dangerously stiff in rough water. Whether by divine instruction or inherited shipbuilding wisdom, whoever recorded those dimensions landed on proportions that would not embarrass a professional hull designer. But here is where the numbers start to become more interesting than their practical value alone can explain. 300, 50 and 30 are not arbitrary measurements. They are multiples of 60, the sacred base number of Mesopotamian mathematics. 300 is 60 multiplied by 5. 50 is 5 multiplied by 10, itself a subordinate unit in the sexagesimal system. 30 is 6 times 5, or half of 60. The entire base 60 counting system, which Mesopotamian civilization developed to extraordinary sophistication, and which we still use today, every time we divide an hour into 60 minutes or a circle into 360 degrees, is embedded in the ark's stated dimensions. Scholars who have examined this closely argue that these numbers were not the result of someone measuring a real boat and recording what they found. They were chosen for symbolic harmony, for the way they resonated within a numerical framework that carried cosmic significance in the ancient Near East. The ark's dimensions are, among other things, a statement about divine order expressed in the language of sacred mathematics. To understand where those proportions came from, you have to go back further than Genesis, back to the Mesopotamian traditions from which the biblical flood story evolved. The oldest known flood tablet, sometimes called the Ark Tablet, which predates Genesis by more than 1,000 years, does not describe a rectangular vessel at all. It describes a coracle, a circular boat roughly 70 meters in diameter, built from coiled reeds and sealed with bitumen, with a floor area of approximately 3,600 square meters. This is the Sufa tradition. Vessels that Iraqi boat builders constructed for centuries by spiraling reeds into round hulls, coating them in pitch and scaling them up as the cargo required. The Hebrew word used for the ark, teva, and the Babylonian term tabu are cognates tracing back through this same lineage, connecting to the Arabic kufa that describe the great round coracles of ancient Mesopotamian river traffic. What happened between that circular coracle and the rectangular vessel of Genesis is one of the more intriguing problems in ancient maritime history. The intermediate step appears in the Gilgamesh epic, where the floodboat shifts from purely circular to something more barge-like, still preserving the same approximate floor area, around 15,000 square cubits, but rearranging that area into a shape more suited to open water navigation. The geometry evolves. The symbolic core is conserved. What began as a river coracle, familiar and practical for Mesopotamian waterways, was reimagined over generations of literary transmission into something with the proportions of a deep-water vessel. The circularity of the original design, so well suited to carrying grain and livestock across the Tigris and Euphrates, gave way to the elongated form better equipped to survive waves rather than currents. Whether this evolution reflects actual shipbuilding practice, literary refinement, or a deliberate theological reframing of the story as it moved into new cultural contexts, most likely all three. The blueprint in Genesis is the final point in a long chain of narrative engineering. The interior of the vessel, as Genesis describes it, is also worth examining on its own terms. 3 decks, a roof with a gap of 1 cubit all around, effectively a continuous ventilation slot running the full length of the structure, which any working shipwright would recognize as a practical necessity for livestock below deck. The arrangement of those 3 decks follows a logic that later commentators in both Jewish and Mesopotamian traditions expanded upon. The lowest level for the large animals and their waste, the middle deck for the human crew and passengers, and the upper deck for birds and smaller creatures. That hierarchy makes functional sense. Putting the heaviest cargo lowest keeps the centre of gravity down, which is exactly what you want in a vessel you're not allowed to steer. Noah is never described navigating the ark. He has no rudder, no sail, no crew of oarsmen. The vessel is designed purely for survival, to stay upright and sealed against catastrophic water, not to go anywhere specific. That design constraint explains a great deal about the proportions. You're not optimizing for speed or maneuverability. You're optimizing for buoyancy, stability, and structural integrity under continuous stress. Which brings us to the material. The text of Genesis specifies that the ark should be built from gopher wood, a term that has puzzled translators and scholars for centuries because the word appears nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible, making comparison impossible. The Greek Septuagint rendered it as squared timber. Later translators guessed at cedar, cypress, and pine, but the most compelling modern theory does not locate gopher wood in any specific tree species at all. The Hebrew koper links to the Akkadian kupru, bitumen, and the related Akkadian verb kaparu, meaning to smear or coat with pitch. Under this reading, gopher wood is not a tree. It is a construction method, timber or reed composite, waterproofed with bitumen, which is exactly how ancient Mesopotamian rivercraft were built. Genesis even reinforces this explicitly, instructing Noah to coat the vessel inside and out with pitch. The bitumen coating is not an afterthought. If kupru is built into the name of the material itself, then the instruction to build from gopher wood and then seal it with pitch may be a purposeful redundancy, a way of saying, in both the name of the material and the explicit command, that this vessel must be made waterproof in the Mesopotamian tradition. Bitumen was not a rare commodity in the ancient Near East. It seeps naturally from the ground at multiple sites in what is now Iraq, and was a standard construction material for boats, baskets, and waterproof storage containers across Mesopotamia for millennia. The use of bitumen to seal the ark places the construction firmly within this practical tradition, not as a miraculous material provided from above, but as the working shipbuilder's solution to the oldest problem in maritime engineering, keeping the water on the outside. What emerges when you lay all of this together is a portrait of a vessel designed at the intersection of sacred numerology and practical necessity. Its dimensions encode Mesopotamian cosmological order. Its proportions, arrived at through a long literary journey from circular coracle to rectangular barge, reflect real thinking about real water. Its three-deck layout follows the logic of weight distribution and ventilation, and its construction material, whatever gopher wood ultimately means, connects to a waterproofing tradition that was keeping Mesopotamian boats afloat for thousands of years before a single word of Genesis was written down. The blueprint in Genesis is not a blueprint in the modern sense, a precise technical document created for fabrication. It is something stranger and richer, a document that carries the accumulated memory of ancient shipbuilding, filtered through sacred mathematics and literary transmission, and compressed into a vessel that no one was ever quite sure they could actually build. So we have the blueprint, we have the proportions, the materials, the three-deck layout, the bitumen waterproofing. The next question is the one that any shipwright worth their salt would ask before a single timber was cut. Would it actually work? Not in the theological sense, in the physical one. A group of physics students at the University of Leicester decided to find out in 2013, running the numbers on a vessel with dimensions closely matching Genesis, roughly 144 meters long, 24 meters wide, 14.5 meters tall, built from timber with a density approximating cypress at around 560 kilograms per cubic meter. What they found was surprisingly encouraging, at least on the surface. The ark, they calculated, would displace the equivalent of about 20 Olympic swimming pools of seawater. Sitting empty, it would ride with a draft of only 0.34 meters, barely scratching the waterline, floating like a massive wooden table just dipping its edges. More significantly, Before water would begin to spill over the deck, it could theoretically support a total cargo weight of roughly 50 million kilograms. That is an almost obscene amount of carrying capacity. On paper, the vessel floats. On paper, it floats with room to spare. But floating is the beginning of the conversation, not the end of it. To understand what the Ark was actually designed to do, you have to strip away any instinct to picture it as a ship. It has no keel, no prow, no stern, no rudder, no sail. Genesis does not describe a vessel that sails anywhere. It describes a vessel that survives. The distinction matters enormously in naval terms. A ship without a keel has no directional stability. It cannot be steered towards safety or away from hazard. It rides at the mercy of whatever the water is doing, turning broadside to waves if conditions demand, drifting wherever the currents carry it. The Ark, by every structural indication in the text, is a barge, a very large, sealed, 3-story rectangular box designed for one purpose: to keep its contents alive while everything outside it is destroyed. That barge-like quality is actually an asset in certain conditions. A box hull with a 6-to-1 length-to-width ratio has what naval architects call high initial stability, a powerful resistance to rolling because the wide, flat bottom generates enormous righting force the moment the vessel tilts. A 2008 analysis using finite element modelling tested a scale replica at 1 to 200 against wave loads, representing swells up to 152 metres in height. The hull held. The box shape absorbed the energy through natural damping, its low centre of gravity fighting the roll back to level. In terms of surviving extreme wave forcing, the geometry performs well. The same study found the vessel's natural frequencies fell between 1 and 4.5 Hz, a range that sits comfortably below the resonance frequencies that could shake a structure apart. So the Ark floats, and it can survive waves. But here is where the optimism starts to crack around its seams. Wood, at the scale required, becomes its own enemy. Euler-Bernoulli beam theory, the mathematical framework that describes how structural members flex and fail, shows that as wooden beams grow longer, their resistance to bending drops dramatically. Not linearly, dramatically. A wooden hull of Ark dimensions would experience enormous hogging and sagging forces. The tendency for the centre of a long hull to flex upward as waves support the ends, and then flex downward as waves support the middle. These forces would concentrate at every joint, every seam, every point where one timber meets another. The Leicester team noted that the beams holding the Ark together could be extremely fragile under these conditions. To resist them, the hull would need either very short, very closely spaced internal frames, dense structural ribbing throughout all 3 decks, or the equivalent of modern longitudinal reinforcement running the full length of the keel that the Ark, by design, does not have. Ancient shipbuilders understood this problem intuitively, if not mathematically. The great wooden warships of the Mediterranean used mortise and tenon joinery, locked with thousands of wooden pegs, a technique that distributed stress across the whole hull rather than concentrating it at a few vulnerable points. Egyptian pharaonic vessels carried external hogging trusses, thick cables or beams running above deck from bow to stern, kept under tension to prevent the hull from breaking its own back in open water. The Ark's blueprint makes no mention of any of these techniques. It is possible that the pitch coating itself provided some binding rigidity. The way bitumen between reed layers gives a coracle more structural cohesion than the reeds alone could manage. But pitch, however generously applied, is not a structural material. It seals water out. It does not hold a hull together. This is the real engineering problem with the Ark, the gap between a vessel that floats and a vessel that endures. Consider what the text actually demands of the structure. Not a single voyage across a calm estuary, not a season at anchor in a harbour. A year at sea. Genesis 7:24 gives 40 days and nights of rain driving the initial flood, but the waters remain above the mountaintops for 150 days before beginning to recede, and the total timeline from the opening of the flood to the drying of the ground runs to over a year. A year of continuous immersion, a year of constant seam stress as the hull alternately absorbs water and dries out in the sun, expanding and contracting, working the pitch loose at every joint. Wooden hulls on long voyages in antiquity required constant maintenance. Caulking hammered back into seams, leaks identified and patched, timbers inspected for rot. The Ark, fully crewed with people and animals, would have had the workforce to perform some of that maintenance. But a hull under a year of continuous submersion stress, with no dry dock period, no ability to beach and inspect the keel that does not exist anyway, faces a different order of challenge entirely. Seagoing wooden vessels in history rarely exceeded about 100 meters before their builders began losing the battle against hull flex. The Great Michael, built in Scotland in 1511, was roughly 73 meters and reportedly consumed most of Scotland's available timber. The famous 19th century clipper ships pushed closer to the Ark's length range, but their builders reinforced wooden hulls with iron diagonal strapping precisely because they knew timber alone could not handle the stress. The largest purely wooden vessel ever built, the Wyoming, was about 100 meters long, and she leaked so badly at her seams from hull flex that she required continuous pumping. She sank in 1927 in a storm. The Ark would have been half again as long as the Wyoming. None of this is to dismiss the engineering entirely. The design shows genuine insight. The barge proportions reduce overturning risk. The ventilation slot is practical. The 3-deck weight distribution reflects real knowledge of how to keep a loaded hull upright. The bitumen caulking is not a myth. It is the standard waterproofing solution of the ancient Near East, confirmed in the archaeological record from Mesopotamian rivercraft spanning thousands of years, and the buoyancy calculations are genuinely reassuring if cargo weight remains within reason. But there is a difference between a vessel that floats on a lake and a vessel capable of surviving what Genesis describes, a catastrophic inundation that covers every mountain on Earth, sustains itself for months, and recedes over the course of a year. That is not an engineering problem. That is a physics problem of a different order, one that requires not merely a seaworthy hull, but a set of conditions so far outside ordinary oceanic experience that conventional structural analysis begins to lose its footing. What the engineering tells us, when you read it honestly, is this. The Ark as described is a plausible floating container. In calm or moderately disturbed water, with carefully managed cargo weight, the dimensions and proportions could work. It is the catastrophic flood itself, its scale, its duration, its violence, that would test the vessel beyond anything timber and pitch could reliably endure. The question of whether the Ark could float almost seems secondary once you start asking what exactly it would have been floating in. So the hull holds, the buoyancy works, at least in principle. But now comes the problem that has occupied theologians, zoologists and skeptics in roughly equal measure for centuries, and it is in many ways a more intimate kind of problem than hull stress calculations. It is the problem of what is living inside that hull and what keeping it alive actually requires. Genesis is specific on one point. Noah was instructed to bring 2 of every living creature aboard, male and female, along with 7 pairs of every clean animal and every clean bird. The survival of the animal world was the explicit purpose of the vessel, so the question immediately follows, how many animals are we actually talking about? The answer depends almost entirely on one word, and that word is kind. Modern taxonomy recognizes somewhere between 8 and 10 million distinct species on Earth, with roughly 1 million of those documented in formal scientific literature. Applied literally, the logistics of 2 of each species become impossible before you have finished writing the manifest. But the biblical Hebrew word used in Genesis is min, often translated as kind, and that word does not map cleanly onto modern species designations. The standard creationist interpretation, drawn from answers in Genesis and the framework behind the Ark encounter in Kentucky, equates a biblical kind with something closer to a family-level taxonomic grouping. Under this definition, all cats, lions, tigers, domestic cats, cheetahs, might trace back to a single ancestral cat kind that sent 2 representatives onto the Ark. The same principle extends through dogs, bears, horses, deer. When researchers at Answers in Genesis applied this framework systematically, they arrived at approximately 1,398 land animal and bird kinds. 2 representatives of each, plus 7 pairs of the clean animals, produces a working estimate of around 6,744 individual animals aboard the Ark. Creation researcher John Woodmarapp, writing for the Institute for Creation Research in 1996, arrived at a figure of roughly 16,000 individuals using a different modelling approach based on logarithmic bodyweight categories. Critically, in his model, the median animal aboard was approximately the size of a rat, not a lion, not a giraffe, not an elephant. Small creatures far outnumber large ones in any classification of Earth's land fauna. Under this distribution, the sheer volume of living cargo becomes far more manageable than the mental image of 2 of every recognizable megafauna side by side. The kind versus species distinction is not a minor semantic adjustment. It is the pivot on which the entire feasibility argument turns. Accept a species-level interpretation, and the Ark is logistically indefensible by any measure of ancient or modern engineering. Accept the family-level kind interpretation, and the numbers become, at minimum, worth examining seriously. Critics argue, with some force, that this reframing raises its own problems, because if every cat alive today descended from a single pair of cat-kind ancestors over 4,000 years, the rate of speciation implied would be dramatically faster than anything observed in the fossil record or genetic research. Literalist apologists respond that post-flood speciation operated under conditions unlike anything we observe today. That debate continues, and it is genuinely unresolved in the literature. But for the logistics of the Ark itself, set the speciation question aside and work with the numbers as the creationist model presents them. 16,000 animals of median rat size aboard a vessel approximately 134 meters long. Does the space accommodate them? Woodmarapp's calculations suggest yes, with considerable volume to spare, even accounting for the 3 decks of internal structure. But available space is only the beginning of the question. Consider what 16,000 living animals consume and produce every single day. Fodder for herbivores, meat or fish for carnivores, and fresh water for all of them. Woodmarapp's study calculated total daily waste output from the combined cargo at approximately 12 metric tons of excreta. 12 metric tons every day for over a year. This is not a minor housekeeping challenge. It is an industrial-scale waste management operation carried out by a crew of 8, Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. The literalist response is that simple drainage systems, sloped floors, and standard agricultural waste handling techniques known from antiquity could have managed this volume within a 10-hour workday. Whether 8 people could physically execute that workday every single day for a year without catastrophic cumulative failure is something each reader has to weigh independently. Water storage presents its own arithmetic. Freshwater animals were presumably not on the manifest. They could survive in the flood itself, however murky and turbulent the mixing of salt water and fresh water might have made conditions for them. But every land animal and bird required drinking water, and the Ark had to carry or collect enough to sustain thousands of creatures across a 371-day voyage. Answers in Genesis modelling suggest cisterns holding roughly a quarter of the total water needed, approximately a 3-month supply at any given time, could be continuously replenished by collecting roughly 1 inch of rain per week from the roof surface. 1 inch per week is not an extreme figure. It approximates average precipitation across a broad swathe of temperate climate zones. Whether precipitation during a global flood would be reliably steady at that rate is, charitably, unknowable. Fodder storage is similarly tractable on paper. Dried grains, hay and compressed plant material have extraordinarily high caloric density relative to their volume. If the median animal is rat-sized, and most of the passengers are herbivores, with modest individual requirements, the arithmetic of stored food begins to work. The interior volume of the Ark, estimated at something close to 40,000 cubic meters across 3 decks, provides meaningful storage capacity once animal housing has been laid out. The calculations, done generously, do not obviously collapse. But then come the problems that arithmetic cannot fully resolve. Predation is one. Place a lion's kind and a gazelle's kind in adjacent stalls for a year, and the structural integrity of those stalls becomes a matter of life and death for the gazelles, and by extension, for the survival of the species the Ark was designed to preserve. Separating predators from prey across 3 decks of a sealed wooden vessel requires careful spatial design, robust physical barriers, and the constant vigilance of a crew already managing 12 metric tons of waste per day. Disease is another. A sealed environment containing thousands of warm-blooded animals in close proximity is epidemiologically fragile in ways that no ancient agricultural framework fully addresses. A single pathogen moving through an enclosed population with no natural reservoir to escape into could theoretically devastate entire categories of the manifest before land was sighted again. Ventilation and light compound the difficulty. Genesis references a single opening near the roof, a window or gap running the length of the structure, but 3 decks of animals generate enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and ammonia, particularly from the waste accumulation that the drainage systems are meant to manage. Passive ventilation through a single longitudinal opening, while better than nothing, cannot reliably cycle air through every corner of a sealed wooden structure whose lower decks are furthest from the source of fresh air. Animals suffering from chronic ammonia exposure in the dark lower decks of a ship with no artificial light source would face serious health consequences well before the 371 days were out. None of these challenges are, strictly speaking, impossible. Literalist scholars have proposed solutions for each of them, some ingenious, some more speculative. The animal collection itself was presumably miraculous in origin. Perhaps the animal's behaviour aboard was likewise divinely managed. Perhaps dormancy or reduced metabolic states reduced waste output, food consumption, and aggression simultaneously. These are theological rather than logistical arguments, and their weight depends entirely on the framework you bring to the text. What this section of the Ark story does, more than any other, is expose the fundamental nature of the question being asked. If you treat Genesis as a literal engineering document, the logistics become a very specific kind of argument, one that demands numbers, volumes, labour hours, and caloric tables. If you treat it as sacred narrative operating under different rules, the logistics become irrelevant to the text's meaning. The reason this debate has persisted for so long, with such intensity, is precisely because neither side can fully occupy the other's terrain. The vessel floats, the animals board, and in the gap between those two facts, 8 people stand alone on a dark heaving sea, holding the world together with their bare hands. 8 people, 12 metric tons of waste per day, a year at sea. And still, underlying all of that logistical reckoning, the most fundamental question has waited patiently for its turn. The animals are aboard, the hull is sealed, the voyage is underway. But where exactly did all the water come from? Genesis does not leave the question unanswered. It answers it in a single verse, chapter 7, verse 11, with a precision that is cosmological rather than hydrological. On the 17th day of the 2nd month, 2 things happened simultaneously. All the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of heaven were opened. Water came from below the earth and from above the sky at the same time, in a coordinated catastrophe that lasted 40 days in the rainfall phase, and continued in its effects for 5 months more. To understand what that sentence meant to its original audience, you have to set aside the mental model of a spherical planet wrapped in a gaseous atmosphere and orbiting a star. The ancient Near Eastern cosmos worked differently. In the worldview that shaped the Genesis text, shared broadly across Mesopotamian, Egyptian and Canaanite traditions, the Earth was a flat disk floating on a vast subterranean ocean. Above it arched a solid dome, the firmament, which physically held back a second ocean pressing down from the heavens. Water was the primordial substance of existence, present on all sides, kept at bay by the structure of creation itself. The firmament's windows were real architectural features of the cosmos, apertures that could be opened to let the upper waters pour through. The fountains of the great deep were equally literal, vents or fissures in the earth's crust where the subterranean waters pressed against the surface and could be released. This is not a primitive or careless cosmology. It is a coherent, internally consistent model of how the world was organized, and within it, a global flood is not only possible, it is almost mechanically simple. You open the windows above and unseal the vents below, and the universe's enormous reserves of water pour inward from both directions simultaneously. The flood in this framework is a partial uncreation, the restoration of the primordial watery chaos that existed before God separated the waters on the 2nd day of creation. That theological resonance was almost certainly intentional. The flood is not just a weather event, it is a reversal of the act of ordering. Modern hydrology and atmospheric science describe a radically different arrangement, and the numbers that emerge from that description are worth sitting with directly because they are remarkable in scale. The entire planetary water inventory, oceans, ice caps, groundwater, lakes, rivers, and atmospheric moisture combined, amounts to approximately 1.386 billion cubic kilometers. That sounds enormous. It is enormous. But to submerge every landmass on Earth to the depth described in Genesis, 15 cubits above the highest mountains, roughly 7 meters above even the peak of Everest, would require something on the order of 4.25 billion cubic kilometers of additional water. That is roughly 3 times the total amount of water that currently exists on Earth in any form. The atmosphere alone offers no meaningful assistance. At any given moment, the entire atmospheric water content, every cloud, every droplet of humidity, every potential rainstorm, amounts to approximately 12,900 cubic kilometers of water vapor. If every molecule of it fell simultaneously, global sea level would rise by roughly an inch. A global flood has to find its water somewhere else entirely, and modern science has no mechanism for delivering it. There is no reservoir, no geological process, no atmospheric cycle that could supply 4 billion cubic kilometers of water that is not already here and then remove it again within a year, leaving no detectable chemical or geological trace in the stratigraphic record that would be inconsistent with ordinary Earth history. This is not a minor scientific objection, and it deserves to be stated clearly without treating it as a refutation of everything the text contains. The Genesis account was written by people who believed with complete intellectual sincerity in a cosmos that held those reserves. They were not wrong to believe it. It was the best model available, coherent with everything observable from the ground. When the windows of heaven opened in their cosmology, there was genuinely enough water behind them to flood the world. The account is scientifically irreconcilable with modern hydrology, not because its authors were foolish, but because they inhabited a different and fully functional understanding of physical reality. That distinction between ancient cosmological plausibility and modern scientific possibility is the key that opens several alternative readings of the text, readings that have gained significant traction among historians, theologians, and geologists who approach the narrative without dismissing it. The regional flood interpretation is the most geologically grounded alternative. Under this reading, the Genesis account preserves the memory of a real catastrophic inundation, an event so overwhelming to the people who experienced it that it was recorded as a destruction of the entire known world, because for them it effectively was. A flood that destroys every settlement, every field, every human being visible from any horizon is functionally equivalent to a global flood. If your world does not extend beyond that horizon, the ancient Near East experienced several candidates for such an event, and researchers have pointed to Mesopotamian flood layers in the archaeological record at sites including Ur, Shuruppak, and Kish, though no single flood layer is contemporaneous across all of them, suggesting multiple distinct regional events rather than one universal catastrophe. Even more evocative is the Black Sea deluge hypothesis, which places a genuine geological catastrophe within the time frame and geography most relevant to the Genesis tradition. Around 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, rising Mediterranean sea levels are believed by some researchers to have eventually breached a land barrier at the Bosphorus, sending salt water cascading into what was then a much smaller freshwater lake basin. Estimates of the inflow run as high as 50 cubic kilometers per day, sustained over roughly 300 days, an inundation covering approximately 100,000 square kilometers of previously inhabited land. That is a flood of breathtaking local scale. Communities living on the margins of that basin would have experienced something that felt like the end of everything. The hypothesis remains debated. Other researchers argue for a slower, more gradual reconnection of the basins rather than a catastrophic breach. But as an origin point for a flood narrative powerful enough to travel across millennia and cultures, it demands serious consideration. A third reading sets aside geography entirely and treats the flood as a theological and literary composition shaped by the cosmological assumptions of its time, a narrative about divine justice, covenant, and renewal rather than a historical report of a meteorological event. Within this framework, asking where the water came from is like asking where exactly Dante stood when he saw the Inferno's gate. The question is not wrong, but it is addressed to the wrong register of meaning. Ancient theological texts routinely used the cosmological language of their era as narrative scaffolding, not as scientific claim. The windows of heaven and fountains of the deep are then understood as the full vocabulary of cosmic catastrophe in the ancient world, the most extreme language available for describing divine action on a universal scale. What is striking about all three of these interpretations is that the cosmology drives the possibility. Ancient audiences heard fountains of the great deep and understood that the mechanism was real, that the water was there, that such a thing could happen because the structure of the world permitted it. Modern readers bring a different map of the world and find different answers to the same question. The text has not changed. The cosmos it assumed has been replaced entirely by one with no windows in its sky and no ocean beneath its crust. that is not a reason to stop reading it. It may in fact be the most important reason to keep reading it carefully. Because what a civilization believes the world is made of shapes, every story it tells about the world being unmade. So the cosmological question resolves into a geographical one. If the water did not fall from a celestial ocean and rise from a subterranean abyss, it had to come from somewhere on Earth's surface, or just beneath it, moving fast, moving far, and leaving a memory powerful enough to survive the passage from spoken story to clay tablet to sacred text. To find those candidates, you have to look at the ground the Genesis tradition grew from, and the ground is more dangerous than it first appears. The ancient Near East was not a stable landscape. It was an environment in active, violent conversation with water, seasonal, sudden, and sometimes catastrophic water that arrived from multiple directions and obeyed no single pattern. The Tigris and Euphrates, the twin rivers that gave Mesopotamia its name and its fertility, were among the most erratic waterways in the ancient world. Each spring, snowmelt from the Anatolian highlands and the Zagros mountains pushed both rivers to discharges estimated at 40 times their low-flow volumes. The alluvial plain they crossed had no natural defences, no bedrock ridges, no elevated banks, just flat, sediment-rich lowland that absorbed the overflow and held it. Archaeological excavations at Ur, one of the great Sumerian city-states, cut through stratum after stratum of human occupation, interrupted by layers of alluvial silt ranging from roughly 1 to 3.5 meters thick, deposited between approximately 4000 and 2000 BCE. These were not gentle risings that gave farmers time to move their grain. They were walls of turbid water arriving faster than a settlement could respond, burying houses, collapsing walls, drowning livestock, and resetting the landscape to a blank of mud. For the people of those cities, this was not a regional inconvenience. It was annihilation. A village on the Euphrates plain with no elevated ground for 50 kilometers in any direction, struck by a flood pulse capable of spreading tens of kilometers across the plain overnight, would experience the obliteration of the entire visible world. Every neighbor, every field, every landmark, every sign of human presence erased beneath water from horizon to horizon. The survivors of such an event carried something specific in their minds, not the memory of bad weather, but the memory of a world that ended and, against all probability, did not take them with it. That distinction between the general catastrophe and the inexplicable personal survival is exactly the narrative nucleus around which flood myths crystallize. The rivers were only one of the mechanisms operating on this landscape. Working backward through geological time, researchers examining paleo-flood deposits in the southern Levant have identified at least 27 large flood events in the Negev region, dated between roughly 33,000 and 29,000 years before present, with peak discharges estimated between 200 and 600 cubic meters per second and average recurrence intervals around 150 years. These figures come with the usual caveats of paleo-flood reconstruction, dating uncertainties that span centuries, discharge estimates derived from sediment grain size and channel geometry rather than direct measurement. But the pattern they reveal is significant. The ancient Near East was periodically crossed by flood pulses of a magnitude that modern instrumental records dramatically underrepresent. The landscape remembers floods that no written archive contains. Then there are the glacial lake outburst floods, a category of event that deserves far more public attention than it typically receives. In the mountain zones flanking the Near Eastern lowlands, the Caucasus, the Zagros, the highlands of eastern Anatolia, rock slides and landslides have periodically dammed river valleys, creating temporary lakes behind walls of debris. Those dams eventually fail, and when they do, the results are extraordinary. A documented early Holocene outburst from a landslide dam lake in the uplifted terrain of the Near East released peak discharges estimated between 64,000 and 132,000 cubic meters per second, with flow depths exceeding 50 meters, dated to approximately 9 to 11,000 years before the present. To put that in perspective, the peak discharge of the Amazon River, the largest river on Earth by volume, runs at roughly 300,000 cubic meters per second. A single dam breach in a mountain lake could release flows at nearly half that rate into valleys and plains that had never seen anything like it, compressing the equivalent of years of river flow into days of obliterating torrent. Settlements in the path of such a flood would not survive it. More importantly, for the transmission of memory, the event would be so far outside any living person's frame of reference that ordinary descriptive language would fail. The vocabulary available for communicating what happened and why was theological and cosmological. Water arrived in impossible quantities from above and from the mountains. It covered everything. Almost no one lived. The few who survived could only explain the event in terms of divine intention, because no natural framework they possessed could accommodate its scale. That experience, repeated across generations at irregular intervals, across the full geographic range of the ancient Near East, built a deep sediment of catastrophic memory in the oral traditions of every culture that inhabited those river systems and coastal margins. Coastal transgressions added a third axis to this hydrological threat. Recent research on the tidal dynamics of early Mesopotamia has proposed that the Persian Gulf coastline shifted substantially over the Holocene period, driven by a combination of sea level rise, sediment deposition, and storm surge events. Communities that established themselves on what appeared to be stable coastal lowland could find that margin overwhelmed by storm-driven inundation, a surge carrying saltwater far inland, killing crops through saline contamination, destroying irrigation systems built over generations, erasing the carefully maintained boundary between the agricultural world and the sea. A 2025 study examining tidal patterns in early Mesopotamia linked repeated storm-driven inundations directly to the emergence of early urban centres like Uruk, suggesting that the pressure of coastal catastrophe was not incidental to the development of civilization there, but potentially formative. Flood and city building grew up together on the same unstable ground. This environmental setting, rivers that could multiply their flow 40-fold in a single season, mountain barriers that periodically collapsed into catastrophic outbursts, coastlines advancing and retreating under storm and sea, was not a backdrop to the genesis of flood narrative. It was the engine of it. People living on the Mesopotamian alluvial plain did not need to imagine a flood that destroyed the world. They inherited the memory of several. What happens to that memory over time is a process that historians of oral tradition have studied extensively. A catastrophic event experienced by one generation does not transmit as a precise meteorological record to the next. It transmits as a story, shaped by the most urgent emotional content of the experience, simplified for retention, amplified in significance, and eventually tied to a moral or theological framework that makes it meaningful rather than merely terrible. The specific flood that buried 3 meters of silt over a Sumerian settlement becomes, over 5 generations of retelling, the flood that covered the mountains. The man who survived by building his boats high and loading his household aboard becomes, over 10 generations, the man chosen by the gods to carry life forward. The story gains structure, archetype, and divine sanction, because that is what stories do when they travel through time without writing to anchor them. Eventually writing arrives. The story finds clay. It gets fixed, partially imperfectly, in one of its many variants, and begins accumulating the properties of a text rather than a living oral performance. the Atrahasis version, the Gilgamesh version, eventually the Genesis version. Each is a crystallization of this long, unstable oral process, shaped by the specific theological concerns of the scribes who recorded it. The real floods are underneath all of them, buried like that silt layer, still pressing upward through the weight of literary tradition. One candidate flood stands above the rest in scale, in timing, and in geographic proximity to the culture that eventually produced the biblical narrative. It did not happen on a river plain, and it was not driven by seasonal snowmelt or mountain lake failure. It happened on the margins of a sea that no longer exists in its original form, in a basin that was once dry land and is now hundreds of meters underwater. That event, and the fierce scientific debate surrounding it, is where this story turns next. In 1997, two Columbia University oceanographers named William Ryan and Walter Pittman published a hypothesis that landed at the intersection of geology, archaeology, and religious history with the force of a depth charge. Their proposal was straightforward in outline, staggering in implication. Sometime around 7,600 years ago, the Bosphorus, the narrow throat of land separating the Black Sea basin from the Mediterranean, gave way. Mediterranean seawater, elevated by the long process of post-glacial sea level rise following the collapse of the Laurentide ice sheet, breached the sill and poured northward into what was then a freshwater lake sitting well below sea level. The inflow, Ryan and Pittman estimated, ran at roughly 50 cubic kilometers per day. The flood advanced across the exposed shelf of the Black Sea basin at a pace that would have driven the shoreline inland by a kilometer or more each day. In total, perhaps 100,000 square kilometers of inhabited lowland, fertile, well-watered, home to Neolithic farming communities, disappeared beneath salt water over a period of at least 300 days. The cascade was self-reinforcing. Once the breach began, the pressure differential between the higher Mediterranean and the lower freshwater basin ensured it would not stop until the levels equalized. No intervention was possible. No preparation would have helped. People living on the Black Sea coastal plain would have watched the water come and kept walking until there was nowhere left to walk. The scientific community's initial response was cautious excitement. Here, finally, was a concrete geophysical candidate, a real, datable, large-scale inundation event that could explain why flood myths clustering around the Near East were so structurally similar and so emotionally specific. Neolithic populations displaced from the Black Sea coast carried that memory outward across Anatolia, into the Levant, into Mesopotamia. Over millennia, the oral account of an unstoppable salt sea swallowing everything familiar was absorbed into the mythological vocabulary of successive civilizations, eventually finding written form in the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh epics and still later in Genesis. The hypothesis gave the flood narrative a biography. It transformed a theological event into a historical one, or at least offered that possibility with enough geological backing to demand serious examination. What made Ryan and Pittman's argument compelling was not just the scale of the proposed flood, but its timing. 7,000 to 9,000 years before the present places the event squarely in the early to middle Holocene, during the spread of agricultural communities across the Near East. The people who might have experienced this flooding were not nomadic hunter-gatherers, whose displacement would leave thin archaeological traces. They were farmers, village builders, people with attachment to specific parcels of land, people whose sense of cosmological order was organized around the reliable return of seasons and water cycles. An inundation that permanently erased tens of thousands of square kilometers of the world they knew would not be forgotten. It would be explained, ritualized, and transmitted across generations with the urgency that survival events always command. The hypothesis attracted enormous popular attention, spawned a best-selling book, and inspired underwater archaeological expeditions searching the drowned Black Sea shelf for submerged Neolithic settlements. Some survey work did identify what appeared to be ancient shorelines and structural features far below the current surface. The connection to flood mythology became a staple of documentary filmmaking and popular science writing through the early 2000s and beyond. For a period, the Black Sea flood felt less like a hypothesis and more like an answer. Then the geology started pushing back. The challenge has come gradually, through the accumulation of more precise proxies and more extensive sediment core data. A major synthesis published in Earth Science Reviews in 2022 by Aksu, Hiscott, and colleagues examined the full range of multi-proxy evidence gathered between 1997 and 2021. Sediment cores from the Black Sea, the Sea of Marmara, and the Aegean, strontium isotope ratios, delta progradation patterns, microfaunal assemblages, and arrived at a conclusion that complicates the Ryan-Pitman model significantly. What this data appears to show is not a single catastrophic breach, but a prolonged, gradual process. According to this analysis, the transition from the Black Sea's isolated freshwater phase began around 10,200 calibrated years before present, with progressive saltwater intrusion occurring over multiple centuries. By roughly 7,500 years ago, salinification was measurably underway, but the process was neither instantaneous nor driven by a single spectacular flood pulse. The review argues for persistent Holocene outflow from the Black Sea toward the Mediterranean rather than a one-time catastrophic inundation in the opposite direction, a scenario that inverts the directionality of Ryan and Pitman's model entirely. The archaeological evidence compounds the difficulty. If 100,000 square kilometres of populated lowland had been rapidly inundated, the displaced populations would leave signatures in the surrounding landscape: sudden settlement abandonment, mass burials, abrupt shifts in cultural material. These signatures have not materialized in the form the hypothesis predicts. Neighboring regions do not show a clear pulse of incoming refugee populations at the relevant time. The pattern of Neolithic site distribution around the Black Sea margins is consistent with gradual coastal adjustment rather than catastrophic displacement. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and Neolithic archaeology in these regions is still far from complete. But the silence of the record at precisely the moment it should be loudest is a problem the hypothesis has not resolved. The timing itself remains in dispute. Radiocarbon dates from mollusk shells and sediment layers yield overlapping but not identical ages depending on methodology and sample material. Some analyses place the key transition closer to 8,800 years ago, others at 7,600, and the difference matters because it affects which human populations were present and in what density. Geological proxies, shifts in sapropel composition, changes in benthic microfauna, can be read as evidence for rapid transgression by some researchers and long-term salinity creep by others, working from the same core material. The Black Sea's sedimentary record is genuinely ambiguous in ways that make confident dating of hydrological events difficult. None of this has killed the hypothesis. It has complicated it, which is what good science does to attractive theories. A number of researchers maintain that even a gradual multi-centennial rise in the Black Sea's level, encroaching steadily across a low-gradient coastal shelf, could produce locally dramatic flooding events that would be experienced as catastrophic by the communities in their path. A shoreline advancing a kilometre per year does not feel gradual to a farmer watching it consume the village his grandparents built. Progressive drowning and catastrophic memory are not mutually exclusive. The oral transmission of such an event would not preserve the subtleties of a geological timeline. It would preserve the experience. Water came, the world ended, and a handful of people survived it. This is ultimately what makes the Black Sea debate significant beyond its geological specifics. It represents a serious attempt to build a bridge between scripture, earth science, and the archaeology of early civilization, to locate mythology in landscape, to treat ancient narrative as a compressed and distorted but potentially real record of environmental history. Whether the Black Sea event was a single catastrophic breach or a century-long transgression, whether it happened at 7,600 or 8,800 years ago, whether it produced the mass displacement its earliest proponents imagined, all of these remain genuinely open questions. What is not in question is that the Black Sea Basin underwent a fundamental transformation in the early Holocene that reshaped the geography, ecology, and potentially the human history of the entire region. What Ryan and Pittman gave the world in 1997 was not a final answer. It was a framework for asking a better question. Not whether a global flood ever covered every mountain on Earth, but whether a real flood, regional, devastating, witnessed and remembered, could have travelled through time in the form of a story. The Black Sea hypothesis is a model, not a fact. It is debated, partially undermined, and still alive. In that condition of productive uncertainty, it has more in common with the best science than with the confident claims of mythology, and it points directly toward the mountain where the most famous search in the history of archaeology has been playing out for centuries. Mount Ararat rises from the eastern Anatolian plateau like something placed there deliberately, a massive snow-capped volcanic cone standing 5,137 meters above sea level, visible from 3 countries, dominating the landscape in every direction for 100 kilometers. It is the kind of mountain that demands explanation. Geologically young, glacially sculpted, perpetually wreathed in cloud above its upper elevations, it carries an atmosphere of inaccessibility that borders on the theatrical. And for roughly 2,000 years it has carried something else, the weight of a tradition that says a ship is buried somewhere in its ice. The association between Ararat and Noah's resting place is not straightforwardly biblical. Genesis uses the phrase mountains of Ararat, referring to a region, Urartu in Assyrian sources, the ancient kingdom centered on the Armenian highlands, not a specific peak. Early Jewish and early Christian commentators placed the landing on various mountains across the Near East. But somewhere in the first millennium, the tradition began to consolidate around the Great Cone itself, and by the medieval period, it had solidified into near certainty in Armenian, Syrian, and European Christian traditions alike. Ararat was the mountain. The Ark was on it. The question was simply whether anyone could reach high enough to find it. For most of history, that question went unanswered because the mountain itself seemed to resist approach. Local tradition held that Ararat was sacred ground, that no human being could reach its summit, that God had sealed it against inquiry. That belief persisted until 1829, when a German-Armenian naturalist named Friedrich Parrot made the first documented modern ascent of Greater Ararat on his 3rd attempt, planting himself at the summit and looking, by his own account, for any sign of the Ark in the glacier fields below. He found none. But he had broken the psychological barrier. The mountain was climbable. Whatever was on it could, in theory, be found. What followed Parrot's ascent was not a systematic scientific investigation. It was something stranger and more human, a rolling procession of adventurers, clerics, treasure hunters, military officers, and true believers, each arriving with different motivations and most leaving with different kinds of ambiguity. Eyewitness accounts accumulated through the 19th century with remarkable consistency of theme and remarkable inconsistency of detail. Local Armenians and Kurds described seeing the prow of a wooden vessel jutting from the glacial ice near the summit. A Turkish military commission surveying the mountain in the 1880s reportedly glimpsed a large wooden structure half embedded in a glacier on the northeastern slope. These accounts entered the literature, were repeated, embellished, disputed, and could never be traced back to verifiable sources. They became the background noise of the search, persistent enough to motivate the next expedition, elusive enough to ensure it would fail. The 20th century brought aircraft, and aircraft changed everything, or seemed to. In 1949, a United States Air Force reconnaissance aircraft photographed the northwestern flank of Ararat and captured an anomalous feature in the upper reaches, a large elongated shape embedded in glacial ice on a rock formation at roughly 15,300 feet, appearing in the imagery with a contour that struck some analysts as boat-like. The images were classified for decades, declassified in 1995, and immediately ignited a new wave of worldwide speculation. The feature became known as the Ararat anomaly. In 2003, high-resolution commercial satellite imagery from QuickBird 2 captured the anomaly with 2-foot resolution, producing measurements of roughly 1,015 feet long by 160 feet wide, dimensions approximately twice the biblical specifications for the ark. Enthusiasts noted the general form. Geologists noted that it matched known patterns of exposed rock ridge line, pressure fracture, and glacial moraine. The anomaly remained exactly what its name suggested, something requiring explanation, yielding none. On the ground, the searches grew more elaborate and more consequential. In 1955, a French industrial explorer named Fernand Navarre descended into a crevasse on Ararat's upper slopes and emerged with what he described as a hand-hewn wooden beam approximately 5 feet long. The discovery was treated by much of the Christian press as confirmation. Navarre's piece of timber went to laboratories. Results varied considerably. Some analyses placed the wood between 260 and 790 AD, medieval timber by any reckoning. Supporters of the find argued that laboratory contamination or glacial compression had corrupted the dates, and some subsequent analyses returned figures closer to 5,000 years, seemingly consistent with a flood chronology. The dispute over Navarre's beam became a template for every contested finding that followed. Physical evidence that could not be fully explained away and could not be confirmed, caught in permanent interpretive limbo. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the search attracted figures who brought both dedication and celebrity. Errol Cummings spent decades cataloguing eyewitness reports and coordinating expeditions. Ray Anderson used helicopter surveys to map the upper elevations. James Irwin, one of 12 human beings who had walked on the moon, secured a presidential Turkish permit in 1982 and led multiple expeditions onto Ararat before rockfalls, avalanches, and the deteriorating security situation in the region forced repeated retreats. Irwin's involvement brought the search an unusual cultural gravity. A man who had seen the Earth from the moon, now searching its highest accessible slope for a relic of its most famous catastrophe. He found nothing. He kept returning. The search had that quality. It consumed people who came to it seriously, not because it rewarded persistence, but because the mountain's scale and inaccessibility made certainty in either direction impossible. That inaccessibility is not merely physical. The upper reaches of Ararat are genuinely treacherous. Sudden weather changes, kilometre-deep crevasse fields, avalanche paths, and altitude effects that compromise judgment precisely when judgment matters most. The glaciers move, which means any object lodged in ice migrates year by year, so a feature visible from the air in one decade may shift, carve, or be buried in the next. But the difficulty is also political. Ararat sits in a militarized zone near the borders of Turkey, Iran, and Armenia, 3 states with complex and sometimes hostile relationships with each other and with the various ethnic and political groups operating in the region. For decades, conflict between Turkish security forces and the Kurdistan Workers' Party made the mountain's eastern approaches genuinely dangerous for any expedition not operating with official sanction. Turkish government permits have been granted and revoked on timelines that seem to bear little relationship to the stated purposes of individual expeditions. Some researchers have waited years for access, only to see permits expire before weather windows opened. The result is a search that has been running for nearly 2 centuries and has produced a library of claims, photographs, testimonies, and specimens that remain individually unverifiable and collectively inconclusive. This is not by itself evidence of a conspiracy or a cover-up. It is the natural consequence of trying to conduct archaeology on a high-altitude stratovolcano in a geopolitically sensitive region, guided by accounts whose origins cannot be traced and whose physical markers disappear under annual snowfall. What the search on Ararat reveals, if nothing else, is the extraordinary persistence of the impulse to find confirmation, to transform a story into a fact by locating its physical remnant. The people who have climbed this mountain looking for the Ark have not been, for the most part, frauds or fools. They have been people responding to a document that billions of human beings regard as sacred, proposing that if the event described in that document actually occurred, then physical evidence must exist somewhere. That is a reasonable inference from the premise. The premise itself is the thing in question, and no amount of searching has settled it. And so Ararat endures as a kind of open file, a mountain perpetually under investigation, its upper glaciers hiding whatever they hide, its weather closing in at precisely the wrong moment, its permits expiring before the work is done. Somewhere below its snow line, 15 kilometres to the northwest, lies a second candidate, a boat-shaped formation in the earth. The durupınar site has been waiting since 1948 for a definitive answer, and for more than 70 years it has not provided one. In 1948, a Turkish army captain named İlhan Durupınar was conducting aerial mapping surveys over eastern Anatolia when something in the terrain below caught his attention. Embedded in the slopes of Mount Tenderek, roughly 3 kilometres north of the Iranian border and about 29 kilometres south of Ararat's summit, was a depression in the earth shaped unmistakably like the hull of a ship. Long, symmetrical, pointed at one end, widening toward the middle. It was not a crater, not a canyon, not any form of erosion that matched the surrounding landscape in obvious ways. Durupınar's photographs reached the international press by 1959, and for a brief moment the world's attention shifted from Ararat's glacier fields to this lower, stranger formation in the volcanic hills below. The dimensions immediately arrested the attention of anyone familiar with the biblical text. The formation measures approximately 164 metres in length, close enough to 150 metres, the length specified in Genesis when a royal Egyptian cubit is used, to constitute a remarkable coincidence by any account. Its width runs to roughly 25 metres at the broadest point, and its height above the surrounding ground reaches approximately 15 metres along the ridgeline. Genesis 6:15 gives the ark's dimensions as 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. The proportional correspondence is striking. Supporters of the site noted this immediately. Critics noted that the cubit itself has multiple historical values, that the correspondence depends on which cubit one selects, and that the formation's match is suggestive only if one has already decided to be persuaded. The structure is composed primarily of limonite, a brown iron oxide mineral that forms through weathering of iron-bearing rocks, embedded within a doubly plunging syncline, which is the geological term for a folded rock layer that curves downward at both ends. This particular shape, when viewed from above or from the right angle at ground level, produces the boat outline that has fascinated observers for more than 7 decades. A peer-reviewed analysis published in 1996 examined the site's geology systematically and concluded that the formation fits squarely within the expected behaviour of sedimentary rock layers rich in limonite and magnetite deformed by tectonic activity. The iron concentrations that supporters had interpreted as evidence of metal fittings or structural brackets were, the analysis concluded, entirely consistent with naturally occurring mineral deposits. The so-called anchor stones nearby, large perforated rocks that some researchers had cited as further evidence of a vessel, were identified as locally sourced volcanic material shaped by entirely natural processes. The geological consensus from that point forward treated durupınar as a fascinating but ultimately unambiguous landform, a natural syncline that happens to be shaped like a ship. That consensus held largely undisturbed until 2021, when a joint Turkish-American research team arrived at the site with a different set of tools and a different set of questions. The team, operating with institutional backing from Istanbul Technical University, spent the summer collecting approximately 30 rock and soil samples from the mound and from the surrounding volcanic peaks. What the laboratory analysis returned was, depending on one's interpretive framework, either highly significant or easily explained away. The sediment samples contained marine particles, clayey material consistent with seafloor deposits, along with what the researchers described as traces of marine shells and organic fragments. Radiometric dating of the organic fraction produced ages spanning roughly 5,500 to 3,000 BCE, a window that overlaps with the period that biblical scholars and some archaeologists associate with the broader cultural memory of a catastrophic flood in the Near East. The team returned in December 2022 for ground-penetrating radar surveys across the formation. The GPR data revealed what the researchers interpreted as angular subsurface structures and enclosed cavities arranged in patterns inconsistent with simple natural rock fracture. They described these as potentially consistent with internal compartmentalization, the kind of organized space one might expect from a vessel's hull divided into sections. Soil chemistry from within the mound showed elevated concentrations of iron and manganese in patterns that the researchers argued could reflect the decomposition of timber over millennia, possibly the gopher wood material described in Genesis, a term that philologists have linked to the Akkadian word for bitumen-rich wood used in ancient Near Eastern shipbuilding. The team published findings across 2022 and 2023 that drew significant media attention and renewed the debate about durupınar's origin. Supporters of the site pointed to the convergence of evidence, dimensions that match the biblical record, marine sediments found at elevation where no sea has been in recorded history, a date range consistent with the flood narrative, GPR anomalies suggesting internal structure, and soil chemistry hinting at decayed organic material. Each of these data points, they argued, was meaningful on its own. Together, they constituted a case worth taking seriously. The mainstream geological and archaeological response was measured and largely unconvinced. Marine microfossils found at elevation are not themselves anomalous in this region. The area around eastern Anatolia has experienced significant geological upheaval, and Holocene lake expansions and river incursions could have deposited marine origin particles at various points over the past several thousand years without requiring a global or even regional catastrophic flood. The radiocarbon dates, critics noted, were derived from bulk sediment samples, which are notoriously susceptible to contamination by older carbon from the surrounding rock matrix, or younger carbon introduced by groundwater movement. The error ranges on such dates can be wide enough to make the apparent precision of the 5,500 to 3,000 BCE range somewhat misleading. The GPR anomalies are real, but ground-penetrating radar in limonite-rich rock produces fracture patterns and mineral boundary reflections that can resemble angular structures without being artificial. Independent validation of the GPR interpretation by researchers unconnected to the original team has not yet been published. Where does that leave the evidence? Honestly, in a state of productive suspension. The marine sediments are real, the GPR anomalies are real, and the soil chemistry anomalies are real. What none of them do, individually or collectively, is rule out natural explanations. A doubly plunging syncline in a volcanically active, tectonically complex region sits in an environment that could produce all of these findings without the involvement of a wooden ship. The convergence that supporters find compelling is, from the skeptic's perspective, precisely what one would expect from a geologically active landscape that happens to have produced a boat-shaped hill. What keeps the controversy alive is not irrationality on either side. It is the genuine difficulty of proving a negative in a location that has not been subjected to the kind of systematic, multi-year, multi-method excavation that would be required to settle the question definitively. The 1996 geological analysis was rigorous for its time and its scope. The 2021 to 2023 work introduced new data, but neither campaign constitutes a full archaeological excavation with stratigraphic control, independent peer review of all findings, and the kind of replicated, transparent methodology that would be required to move the site's status from contested to settled in either direction. There is something fitting about the durupınar formation's position in the broader story. It sits below the famous mountain rather than on it, away from the routes that generations of ark hunters have climbed, shaped by forces entirely indifferent to human expectation. It was found not by a believer searching for confirmation, but by a military cartographer doing routine work. Its dimensions correspond to the biblical text well enough to be interesting, and ambiguously enough to be disputed. It has now attracted serious scientific attention and resisted definitive interpretation for more than 7 decades. In that way, it resembles every other piece of evidence in this search, real, measurable, and stubbornly open to more than one story about what it means. The durupınar formation, then, offers something more than a geological puzzle. It offers a window into a much larger and more persistent phenomenon, the way a single, charged object can simultaneously attract rigorous scientific inquiry, wishful interpretation, outright fabrication, and commercial opportunity, sometimes all at once, sometimes in the same person. To understand why the search for Noah's Ark has produced so much noise and so little settled knowledge, it helps to understand exactly what archaeological evidence is, how it is established, and why the standards that govern it are not bureaucratic obstacles, but hard-won defences against the very human tendency to find what we are looking for. Archaeology, at its methodological core, is built around material remains, the physical traces that human activity leaves in the ground, in rock, in sediment, in the chemical signatures of soil. For prehistoric periods, these traces are not supplementary to the historical record. They are the historical record. Establishing what those traces mean requires a disciplined sequence of operations. Stratigraphic excavation that records each layer's precise position and relationship to surrounding layers. Absolute dating methods like radiocarbon and dendrochronology applied to appropriate materials under controlled conditions, and interdisciplinary analysis, petrology, metallurgy, palynology, that draws on independent lines of evidence to build a converging picture. Before any of this reaches the public domain through a reputable journal, it passes through double-blind peer review, a process in which independent experts with no stake in the outcome evaluate the methodology, scrutinize the data, and demand transparency about potential sources of error or bias. This is not a perfect system, but it is a self-correcting one. It is designed specifically to prevent individual enthusiasm from masquerading as collective knowledge. The search for Noah's Ark has, with remarkable consistency, operated outside this system, not always out of bad faith, but often out of an understandable impatience with the gap between what believers hope to find and what the slow machinery of disciplined science can confirm. the pattern repeats across decades. A dramatic claim surfaces, usually attached to a photograph, a fragment, or a measurement that seems to align with the biblical dimensions. Media organizations, drawn by the story's universal recognizability and emotional resonance, amplify it before independent verification is possible. By the time geologists or archaeologists weigh in with careful analysis, the original claim has already completed its circuit through the public imagination and hardened into received wisdom in certain communities. The correction, when it comes, rarely achieves the same reach as the original announcement. The durupınar site illustrated this cycle as early as 1960, when Life magazine published the aerial photographs durupınar had taken, and the formation's rough dimensional correspondence to Genesis became an instant sensation. What the Life feature could not convey, what a photograph never can, is the geological context that a trained field geologist reads immediately upon arrival. The limonite-rich rock, the doubly plunging syncline, the predictable behaviour of iron oxide minerals under the weathering conditions present in that part of eastern Anatolia. The image showed a shape. The shape was real. But the interpretation of that shape as a ship required a chain of inferences that the photograph itself could not support, and that subsequent analysis would not support either. The claims that accumulated around the site in later decades followed a similar logic of selective attention. Researchers using metal detectors reported linear anomalies beneath the surface and described them as iron brackets or structural fittings from a massive wooden hull. Geologists examining the same data pointed out that magnetite, a naturally magnetic iron ore mineral common throughout the region, produces exactly these kinds of linear signatures when it occurs in folded sedimentary layers. What looked like purposeful metal placement was, under examination, the expected magnetic profile of tectonically deformed rock. Animal coprolites were reported inside the mound. Laboratory analysis found no biological markers consistent with fossilized feces. Samples described as petrified wood were identified as limonite nodules, which can produce a superficially wood-like appearance through differential weathering. None of these refutations required extraordinary counter-evidence. They required only the application of standard methods to the specific claims being made. By 2021, the cycle had migrated online, where its speed and reach had grown beyond anything the Life magazine era could have anticipated. Sensational advertisements. Scientists claim they finally found Noah's Ark, circulated across social media platforms, driving traffic to slideshow websites that recycled the same debunked evidence in new packaging, stripped of its refutations and dressed in the language of imminent discovery. Confirmation bias, the well-documented cognitive tendency to weight evidence that supports an existing belief more heavily than evidence that challenges it, does not require deception to operate. Most people who shared those posts were not lying. They were doing what human cognition does efficiently and automatically, filtering incoming information through a framework already in place. This is where the distinction between believers, skeptics, and entrepreneurs becomes both important and somewhat unstable. Genuine faith-driven researchers have approached the Ark search with real commitment and sometimes real methodological care. They are not a monolith, and reducing them to credulous wishful thinkers misrepresents a complicated community that includes trained scientists and field-experienced geologists. Genuine skeptics bring their own prior commitments, and the certainty with which some dismiss any site or claim can itself function as a kind of confirmation bias running in the opposite direction. And entrepreneurs occupy a different category entirely. They are not primarily interested in the question of whether the Ark existed, only in whether the public's fascination with that question can be converted into revenue. The commercial dimension is not incidental. The Ark Encounter theme park in Williamstown, Kentucky, a full-scale timber recreation of the Ark as specified in Genesis, recorded 14,724 paying visitors in January 2023 alone, up from 11,030 the previous January, and its operators have aimed for 1 to 2 million annual guests. The park does not claim to be an archaeological site. It claims to be an experiential argument, a physical demonstration that the vessel described in Genesis was buildable, a three-dimensional assertion that the text is physically coherent. Whether or not one finds that argument persuasive, the commercial logic behind it is transparent. The Ark, as a cultural object, draws crowds. The question of its historicity has become, in this context, secondary to the question of its marketability. What makes the Ark uniquely suited to this kind of contested public existence is the particular combination of properties it possesses as an object in the imagination. It is ancient enough to be mysterious. It is specific enough, in dimensions, in material, in mission, to invite physical investigation. It is described in texts that carry enormous religious authority for billions of people, which means that any evidence bearing on its historicity is automatically loaded with stakes that extend far beyond archaeology, and it is proven resistant enough to definitive resolution that the question remains permanently open, which is precisely the condition that sustains both sincere inquiry and opportunistic exploitation. Contested artifacts are not simply found, they are constructed, assembled in the public imagination through the accumulation of claims, counterclaims, media cycles, institutional responses and community narratives that accrete around an object over time. The durupınar formation did not become the object it is today through geology alone. It became what it is through 70 years of photographs, measurements, refutations, renewed interest, Turkish government site designations, American evangelical funding, social media algorithms, and the persistent human desire to locate the moment when the ancient story touched the ground. The geology is real, but the object, the Ark site as a cultural fact, is something built from all of those layers together. Understanding this does not dissolve the geological questions, and it does not resolve the historical debate. What it does is clarify what kind of evidence could, in principle, move the conversation forward. Systematic excavation conducted by a multi-institutional team with no financial or ideological stake in a particular outcome, with full stratigraphic control, transparent data sharing, independent peer review, and the patience to let the ground speak before the press release is written. That kind of investigation has never been completed at any Ark site. Until it is, every claim, whether it arrives in a scientific paper, a documentary, or a social media carousel, deserves the same measured response, genuine curiosity, and genuine insistence on the standards that separate knowledge from belief performed as knowledge. If the search for Noah's Ark has spent decades chasing a relic buried somewhere beneath volcanic rock and contested soil, a parallel project has been quietly proceeding in the opposite direction, not digging down into history but building upward from it. While geologists argued over limonite formations and archaeologists demanded peer-reviewed stratigraphic data, a different group of people decided to settle the question of the Ark's plausibility the most direct way they knew, by constructing it. The most literal attempt came from a Dutch carpenter named Johan Hebers, who had dreamed of building a full-scale replica since a nightmare about Holland flooding in the 1990s. His first version, roughly half the biblical dimensions at about 70 meters, sailed Dutch waterways beginning in 2007 and attracted somewhere around 600,000 visitors. Undeterred and apparently encouraged, Huybers went further. The completed full-scale vessel, launched between 2008 and 2010, measured 122 meters long, 29 meters wide, and 27 meters tall, built atop a platform of 25 lash barges that gave it the buoyancy a wooden hull of that scale could never have maintained on its own. Inside, visitors found live animals, 2 cinemas, a restaurant and a conference hall. The vessel was engineered carefully enough to navigate Dutch locks and clear Dutch bridges, which meant the ancient proportions had to dance in negotiation with modern waterway infrastructure. That constraint alone tells you something significant. Hybers was not rebuilding the Ark as an ancient ship. He was translating it, converting a set of ancient numbers into a contemporary object that could function in a world of port authorities and insurance regulations. That act of translation forces choices that the biblical text deliberately leaves open. The Genesis dimensions, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, are precise in ratio but undefined in absolute scale, because the length of a cubit varied across ancient cultures and across centuries. When Answers in Genesis began constructing their Ark encounter in Williamstown, Kentucky, they settled on a royal cubit of 20.4 inches, placing their structure at 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 54 feet tall. That choice produced the world's largest freestanding timber frame building, which opened in 2016 as a full theme park with animal enclosures, zip-line tours, and a virtual reality experience called the Truth Traveler. The cubit selection was not arbitrary. It sits at the shorter end of historically attested cubits, which conveniently produces a smaller vessel while remaining defensible within the range of Mesopotamian and Israelite measures. A longer cubit, fully within historical possibility, would have yielded a ship larger than most modern aircraft carriers. The builders chose the number that made their argument most efficiently. That is not dishonesty. It is interpretation, and it is exactly the kind of interpretive move that ancient scribes, translators, and commentators made at every stage of the text's transmission. The Ark encounter does not present itself primarily as a historical reconstruction. It presents itself as an experiential argument for biblical literalism, a physical answer to the question of whether the vessel described in Genesis was physically coherent. Walk through it, the logic runs, and you will see that it could have been done. The animal displays are organized to show how species groupings might have reduced the total number of distinct kinds on board, sidestepping the biological problem of individual species with the theological concept of Barramin. The engineering exhibits explain how ventilation and waste management could, theoretically, have been managed. Attendance figures tell part of the story. The park drew somewhere between 750,000 and over 2 million visitors in its opening years, with estimates varying depending on whether you trust company projections or independent public record analyses. June 2023 alone recorded over 111,000 visitors. Whatever the precise count, the crowds are real, and they are not arriving primarily to examine naval architecture. They are arriving because the Ark, as a cultural object, now carries weight far beyond any single question of historical or nautical fact. It has become an identity marker, a way of publicly affirming a relationship to scripture, to tradition, to a community that reads Genesis as literal testimony rather than literary inheritance. The devotional and commercial dimensions here are inseparable in ways that make simple criticism easy, but genuine understanding harder. A gift shop selling Ark-branded merchandise is a commercial operation. It is also, for the person making the purchase, potentially a devotional act, a souvenir of an experience that confirmed something they already believed or deepened something they were working toward believing. The Ark's branding power, it now appears on regional tourism logos, merchandise, political messaging about flood preparedness, and civic identity campaigns in the counties around Williamstown, derives precisely from this fusion of the sacred and the commercial, which is itself an ancient phenomenon. Temples have always sold things. The digital reconstructions operate in a somewhat different register, though they share the same underlying challenge of translating ancient specifications into modern geometry. Three-dimensional laser scanning, photogrammetry, and ground-penetrating radar have been applied to the durupınar formation by firms like Topa 3D, producing high-resolution point cloud models that allow anyone with an internet connection to explore the site's topography in 3 dimensions. Interactive models hosted on platforms like Sketchfab and deployed in museum exhibits offer a different kind of encounter with the Ark's dimensions, one that is less commercial spectacle, a more analytical tool, though the boundary between the two blurs quickly when a 3D visualization is used to support a claim that the site is archaeologically significant. What all of these projects share, the floating Dutch replica, the Kentucky theme park, the digital models spinning on a screen, is the ancient question of the ship's design, brought forward into the present and forced to answer for itself under conditions the original builders, if they existed, never faced. Johan Hebers had to make his Ark navigate infrastructure. The Ark Encounter's designers had to make their qubit choice defensible in an era of online fact-checking. Digital reconstructors have to distinguish between a model that accurately represents an object and a model that merely looks compelling. Each of these pressures corresponds in a different key to the original engineering problems that any builder following the Genesis blueprint would have encountered. How do you translate a ratio into a functional vessel? How do you make the numbers work in the material world, given that the material world is indifferent to your intentions? The honest answer that each of these projects implicitly provides, even when their stated purpose is affirmation rather than inquiry, is that the translation is never clean. Something is always lost, added, or adjusted. The modern Ark is never quite the ancient one, not because the builders lack skill or commitment, but because every reconstruction embeds the assumptions of its own moment. The Ark Encounter's Ark is a 21st century evangelical argument dressed in timber. Johann's Ark is a Dutch entrepreneur's dream shaped by canal locks and safety codes. The digital models are data visualizations whose persuasive power depends on what question you're using them to answer. None of them reaches back across 4,000 years to the thing itself, whatever that thing was. This may be the most clarifying observation these projects offer, though it cuts against their typical promotional logic. By rebuilding the Ark, each project makes visible the interpretive machinery that was always present in the original story. The choices embedded in the text, the dimensions that had to be translated, the animals that had to be counted, the materials that had to be named and sourced. The act of physical construction forces questions that reading alone can defer indefinitely. And in forcing those questions, the replicas do not resolve the ancient mystery so much as they illuminate its depth. They show how much the original story requires you to bring to it, how much imagination, assumption, and interpretive will must be supplied before a set of ancient numbers becomes anything resembling a ship. In that sense, every rebuilt Ark is not a final answer, but a new kind of evidence. Evidence about the people who built it, the culture that funded it, and the persistent, shape-shifting power of a story that refuses to stay in the past. So what do we actually have after everything? After the clay tablets and the qubit calculations, the sediment cores and the satellite images, the expedition journals and the theme park gift shops, what does the Ark amount to? The answer is that it amounts to several different things simultaneously, and that is precisely why it refuses to disappear. Start with what the evidence genuinely supports. There was a literary tradition, rooted deep in Mesopotamian culture, that preserved the memory of catastrophic flood events through the story of a chosen survivor who builds a vessel and endures. That tradition predates the Genesis account by centuries. The Atrahasis epic, written around 1700 BCE, gives the outline: divine displeasure, a warning, a boat, a flood, a survivor, a sacrifice, a new world. The Epic of Gilgamesh elaborates and dramatizes. Genesis inherits, reshapes, and reframes the material through the theological lens of covenant and monotheism. These are not three versions of a rumour. They are a continuous literary evolution, trackable across tablets, manuscripts, and centuries. And they carry inside them the deep cultural memory of communities that lived along rivers and coastlines and knew, from hard experience, what catastrophic water could do. That cultural memory almost certainly encoded real events. We know that large-scale floods happened in the ancient Near East. We know that the Black Sea region underwent dramatic hydrological transformation roughly 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, as rising Mediterranean waters eventually breached the Bosphorus threshold and transformed a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea. Whether that transition was catastrophic or gradual remains actively debated in the geological literature, but the event was real. It displaced human populations, and it left geological signatures that are still being read and interpreted today. Other flood events, river floods, coastal inundations, episodic deluges of the Tigris-Euphrates floodplain, recurred throughout the ancient world with enough regularity to become the organizing catastrophe of cultural imagination. The myth did not require a single global flood. It required floods to be terrifying, common, and occasionally civilization-ending, which they were. Then there is the Ark itself, not as a vessel, but as a blueprint, as a thought experiment in applied engineering. The Genesis dimensions, 300 cubits long by 50 wide by 30 high, translate in one respected calculation to roughly 134 by 22 by 13 meters. A 2023 study by physics students examining the same proportions with slightly different cubit assumptions arrived at a hull approximately 144.6 meters long, concluding that such a vessel built from cypress wood could displace enough water to remain buoyant under a cargo load of around 50 million kilograms, theoretically the weight of about 2 million sheep. The text, in other words, describes a vessel that is not physically absurd on paper. Whether it could have been built from the timber technology available in the ancient Near East, whether it could have been structurally sound over weeks at sea in storm conditions, whether its interior could have sustained thousands of animal species with adequate ventilation and waste management, those questions push past theoretical buoyancy into real-world material constraints that no paper model yet resolves. The engineering conversation is genuinely interesting, which is why it keeps generating fresh papers and calculations. The Ark as a naval problem is unfinished business in the best possible sense. The search for the Ark's physical remains adds another layer, one that blends legitimate archaeology with what scholars of the field candidly call pseudo-archaeology. No expedition has produced peer-reviewed physical evidence of a man-made vessel on Ararat or anywhere else. The durupınar formation, whose rock and soil analyses have been revisited as recently as 2021 and 2023, continues to divide opinion between researchers who see marine sediment anomalies and human activity signatures dating to 5,500 to 3,000 BCE as potentially significant, and the geological mainstream, which classifies the formation as a naturally eroded limonite structure shaped by the mountain's volcanic history. The controversy is real, but it is also telling. The reason these surveys keep being funded, the reason journalists keep flying to eastern Turkey, is not purely scientific. It is that the Ark hunt carries enormous cultural stakes for the communities invested in it. That investment does not make the searches dishonest. It makes them human, which is to say, it makes them continuous with every other moment in this story's history, when what people needed to find shaped what they went looking for. And then there is the living cultural fact of the story itself, which is perhaps the most durable evidence of all. A 2024 Gallup poll found that 37% of American adults endorse a young Earth view that includes the flood and the Ark as literal historical events. The Ark encounter in Kentucky draws roughly 1.5 million visitors each year, functioning simultaneously as a tourism operation, an engineering argument, and a platform for creation science advocacy. Contemporary environmental humanities scholarship has begun reading the Ark as a thought experiment on climate crisis. The 2023 volume Noah's Archive frames the narrative as a lens for examining questions of refuge, exclusion, and ecological responsibility in the Anthropocene, treating the Ark not as a relic but as a still active conceptual tool for confronting what it means to survive a world-ending environmental event by making choices about who and what gets saved. Flood myths appear in parallel across Hindu, Buddhist, Zoroastrian, Islamic, Greek, Chinese and indigenous Australian traditions, documented in a 2023 comparative study that identified shared motifs. Divine judgment, a chosen survivor, animal pairs, a new beginning. Across cultures with no direct literary contact, suggesting that the deep structure of the flood narrative taps something more fundamental than any single text. Whether that something is shared memory of real prehistoric inundations, or a universal narrative template built from the universal human experience of water as both life-giver and destroyer, or some interaction between the two, remains genuinely open. This is where the Ark becomes most interesting and most difficult to categorize. It is scripture for billions of people, carrying theological weight that no archaeological finding can either confirm or erase. It is inherited mythology, traceable through a literary genealogy that runs from Mesopotamian river valleys through the Hebrew scribes of the 8th century BCE and onward into every culture that received any branch of the Abrahamic traditions. It is an engineering thought experiment that serious researchers keep returning to precisely because the numbers are tantalizingly close to coherent. It is an archaeological obsession that has consumed careers, budgets, and expeditions for over a century without yielding decisive physical evidence. It is a commercial product moving through souvenir shops and streaming platforms. It is a climate parable for a century increasingly preoccupied with the rising seas. It is a symbol of identity for communities whose relationship to Scripture is not abstract, but existential. What makes the Ark powerful is not that it sits cleanly in any one of these categories. It is that it refuses to. A story that could be settled by a single archaeological find, or disproved by a single geological survey, or explained away by a single comparative religion paper, would have been settled, disproved, or explained away long ago. The Ark survives because it operates at the intersection of everything: history and theology, memory and myth, engineering and faith, past catastrophe and future anxiety. Each discipline that approaches it finds something genuine to examine and something that escapes its methods entirely. What the evidence genuinely supports is this: real floods happened, and people survived them and told stories about it. Those stories were refined across millennia into a narrative of extraordinary power and reach. The dimensions of the vessel in that narrative are not physically ridiculous, and they share structural DNA with real ancient shipbuilding traditions. No physical Ark has been found, and the probability that one could survive intact across 4,000 to 5,000 years of volcanic, seismic and glacial activity is extremely low, which means the absence of physical evidence is genuinely uninformative in either direction. What the evidence cannot support is certainty. Certainty that the event happened as described, certainty that it didn't, certainty that a specific mountain holds the hull, certainty that no flood of significance underlies the myth. What remains unknowable, at least by any method currently available, is whether there was a singular vessel, a singular man, a singular moment when the waters rose and something built by human hands rode over the destruction of a known world. That question lives in the gap between what geology can date and what Scripture claims, between what engineering can model and what faith requires, between what comparative mythology can trace and what lived experience once felt. That gap is not a failure of the story. It is arguably the source of its endurance. The arc holds its place at the edge of memory because it keeps asking questions that no single answer has ever been large enough to close. So here is where everything converges, and where it honestly refuses to resolve. The biblical narrative at the center of this story describes a vessel of specific, calculable dimensions built by a specific man under specific divine instruction to carry a specific cargo through a specific catastrophe. That precision is part of what has kept researchers returning to it for centuries. The numbers are not mythological padding. They mirror the base 60 numerology embedded in Mesopotamian mathematics. They share structural proportions with ancient Near Eastern shipbuilding traditions, and they describe a hull that naval engineers modelling barge-type designs have found to be, by certain stability indices, more seaworthy than it has any right to be if it were purely invented. A vessel roughly 135 metres long, 22 metres wide and 13 metres deep is not a fantasy. It is a serious piece of engineering on paper, which is exactly why serious engineers keep running the calculations. But the story didn't begin with Genesis, and it did not stay there. The flood narrative travelled through at least 2 earlier Mesopotamian iterations before it reached the Hebrew scribes who shape the version most of the world now knows. Atrahasis warned of divine judgment long before Noah was named. Utnapishtim survived the deluge in Gilgamesh centuries before the covenant of the rainbow was written. Those earlier texts are not borrowings from a common rumour. They are the traceable literary ancestors of a tradition, and they carry inside them the accumulated memory of communities who lived where rivers flooded seasonally, where coastlines shifted catastrophically, and where water was the most reliable agent of both life and death they had ever encountered. That accumulated memory almost certainly has geological roots. The Black Sea transformation, that slow or sudden breach, depending on which sediment core you believe, somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 years ago, displaced populations and reshaped coastlines across a region that would later produce the earliest written civilizations. Whether it was the catastrophic roar of 10 cubic kilometers of Mediterranean water per day, flooding 100,000 square kilometers, or a slower, less dramatic process, as the 2022 Earth Science Review's synthesis argues, something happened there, and people were present for it, and they told each other about it. Flood myths appear in parallel across Hindu, Buddhist, Zoroastrian, Islamic, Greek, Chinese, and indigenous Australian traditions, each carrying the same compressed core: divine judgment, a chosen survivor, animal pairs, a world remade, in forms too structurally similar to be entirely coincidental, yet too geographically dispersed to descend from a single source document. Real floods, in real places across real millennia, gave different cultures independent reasons to encode catastrophic water into their deepest stories. And then there is the search for the object itself, which has consumed careers and budgets and expeditions, and occasionally careers again after the budgets ran out. Ararat remains unresolved. The durupınar formation, with its limonite ridges and its marine sediment signatures and its radiocarbon dates, clustering between 3,000 and 5,000 years before the present, continues to generate competing interpretations: genuine geological curiosity on one side, geological consensus on the other, both sides talking past each other with measurements from the same mountain. No expedition has produced peer-reviewed physical evidence of a man-made hull anywhere on or near Ararat. That absence is real. It does not prove the story false. The probability of any wooden vessel surviving intact through thousands of years of volcanic, seismic and glacial activity is vanishingly small. But it does mean that the physical search has so far returned nothing definitive, and intellectual honesty requires saying so plainly. What the search has revealed, perhaps more usefully, is how much the act of looking tells us about the lookers. The Ark Hunt reflects at every stage the cultural moment of the people doing the hunting. 19th century travellers mapping the Ottoman frontier, Cold War reconnaissance programs scanning enemy territory, 21st century research teams armed with ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery, all finding in the same mountain the thing they were most prepared to find or fail to find. That is not a criticism. It is an observation about how memory and evidence interact across time, which is precisely what this entire story is about, because that is the thread that runs through everything here. Ships preserve memory, stories preserve memory, disasters preserve memory, and they do not preserve it in the same way or at the same resolution. A geologist reading sediment cores recovers the event itself, the salinity shift, the shoreline change, the layer of disrupted soil, but loses the human experience entirely. A scribe recording the flood narrative preserves the human experience, the terror, the survival, the covenant, the promise of a rainbow, but translates the event into theological meaning that cannot be carbon dated or core sampled. A shipwright building to specifications preserves the craft knowledge, the timber ratios, the hull geometry, the displacement calculations, but cannot tell you whether those specifications were drawn from memory, imagination, or both. Each of these channels of preservation is real, each is incomplete, and each, on its own, is insufficient to settle the question. The Ark continues to matter because the questions it raises have not aged. Judgment and survival, evidence and belief, the sea as destroyer and the vessel as refuge. These are not ancient concerns stored safely in the past. They are the terms in which people still think about what it means to be chosen, or lucky, or prepared when the water rises. The story outlasted the civilizations that first told it. It outlasted the tablets they wrote it on. It is still being told, still being built at life-size scale in Kentucky, still being searched for on a volcanic mountain in eastern Turkey, still being read as prophecy or parable or engineering blueprint depending on who is reading it and what they need it to say. The Ark sits at the edge of memory because the edge of memory is exactly where the most important questions live.